Let's take an early look of the crash of a 1966 Cessna 172 on a bridge north of Miami this past Saturday. The crash killed the 36-year-old pilot and seriously injured his two adult relatives in the plane with him. On the ground, the airplane struck an SUV and a woman and her two children reported minor injuries. We'd like to caveat these early analysis videos that the NTSB investigation is underway and it's early. They could uncover facts which would change our understanding of this accident. The pilot was not the owner of the airplane. He was a controller at Miami TRACON, and he was a friend of a co-owner of the airplane who also worked at Miami TRACON. The first flight of the day began at Homestead Airport, where the airplane was based. The pilot departed Homestead, flew about 30 minutes up to North Perry, and loaded his two adult relatives in the airplane. He was on the ground for about 28 minutes before he taxied and then took off for the flight that was destined to go from North Perry east to the coast of Florida, then fly down south underneath Miami's Class Bravo to Key West, the ultimate destination. The pilot departs North Perry eastbound and climbs up to approximately 1,200 feet. He bends south. It appears as if he's staying south of Fort Lauderdale's Class Charlie airspace, and he climbs to 1,200 feet to stay below Miami's Class Bravo airspace, which in the area he was flying had a bottom of 3,000 feet. He turns southbound. We have reports he's talking to Miami TRACON and receiving flight following. As he heads southbound, approximately 10 minutes or so into the flight, he makes a right-hand turn to begin coming back north, just inward of the coastline. We have reports that the pilot told Miami TRACON he was experiencing an engine problem. The pilot turned north, a right-hand turn north, and in doing so passed over the coast, and he's now inland by a couple thousand feet. As he continues north in a glide, his speed throughout this glide is approximately 80 miles an hour, 85 miles an hour. That's about what the book calls for in a glide, or 172. For that model, it calls for 80 miles per hour best glide. He holds approximately 85 miles per hour based on ADSB data. Remember, ADSB data is ground speed. He did have a 10-knot tailwind, it appears, from the south. Weather in the area reported about 170 at 8 to 9 knots of wind coming out of the south. So as he's cruising up the road, he makes the decision to stay inland and cruise up the road. His engine problem apparently becomes tough enough that he can no longer maintain level flight. The pilot stays along the road inland, just west of the tall condominiums on the beach, and attempts a landing on a bridge. We can see from video that's provided by Miami media that the pilot has the airplane well under control as he approaches the landing on the bridge. Even within about 10 feet, as the airplane comes by, we can see two things that are important. The propeller is windmilling, which means the engine has not seized, and his flaps are up. It's significant that the flaps are not extended, as we can see in the video here. Normally, for an off-airport landing, you would have the flaps extended to their fullest position. The idea is to slow the airplane down as much as possible to reduce landing rollout and also to reduce damage and potential injuries due to speed on touchdown. The idea is get as slow as you possibly can. In this case, his flaps are up. That may have been intentional. We don't know why, if he chose to do that or if that was an oversight on the pilot's part. As he comes down, he goes out of sight, and the next thing we know of is the airplane hits an SUV, flips, and bursts into flames. The pilot was killed. The two adult passengers were able to escape the airplane with some assistance from a passerby who happened to be a off-duty fireman. So let's talk about factors in the accident that are likely to be a subject of the investigation by the NTSB. Chief among them is the engine malfunction. There are several elements to consider in an engine malfunction in no particular priority. Mechanical is one. There's some evidence that the airplane had some mechanical operation due to the windmilling propeller. Of course, that's not the full operation, but the NTSB will certainly look at that. It's amazing how much the NTSB can tell from a wrecked airplane, even one with a devastating fire, about the mechanical operation of an engine. Another issue is fuel, contamination, exhaustion, or starvation. Contamination doesn't seem to be an issue because the pilot flew from Homestead to North Perry, and it doesn't seem as if he had enough time to refuel and load passengers before he launched again, although we don't know that for certain. Fuel exhaustion doesn't seem to be the problem because of the crash and the ensuing fire indicated a lot of fuel on board the airplane at the time of the crash. Fuel starvation could be an issue. Starvation is when there's fuel on board the airplane, but it's not making it to the engine. It's trapped in one tank or another. The NTSB will try to determine, if they can, if fuel starvation was at fault. And then finally, pilot action. Mixture, carb heat, magnetos, those fuel tank selectors, those kinds of things, the NTSB will try to determine if the pilot action was appropriate under this scenario. And then they'll move to pilot decision making. To start with, the pilot makes a decision when he's having a rough running engine or engine problems to make a right-hand turn to go inland as opposed to a left-hand turn to go further out to the Atlantic Ocean. Some things pilots would normally consider would be whether or not there's flotations on board, whether or not any of the people on board the aircraft can swim. And if your airplane is experiencing engine problems, you wouldn't really turn towards the sea and take yourself further away from gliding distance back to land. With a rough running engine, he really had three options. He could have headed south to Miami. The pilot was a controller, so it's not likely that he was intimidated to go to Miami. He very likely chose not to go to Miami International. He also, to the west, about the same distance, maybe a little bit shorter, had Opelika Airport, and then just a mile or so farther than either of those was to return back to North Perry Airport. Those were his three options. And it appears as if he makes his turn to determine to head back in the direction of North Perry. Perhaps the NTSB can uncover that as they find the communications with Miami TRACON. We were unable to find those communications in our research. We don't know exactly when the engine began running rough enough to where the pilot realized he was going to have to make an off-airport landing. As he makes his turn back northbound, he's still got altitude and he could still pass over the wall of the condominiums to his right, but he decides not to. He stays along the road and continues in a slight descent, gliding his way through, and at some point he does get low enough to where he can no longer get through or get over on top of the condominiums to his right to the beach. So the decision the pilot made at some point was the engine was running rough enough, he was going to have to make an off-airport landing. Does he make the off-airport landing on the road in front of him, on the intercoastal waterway or the bays to his left, or move to the right side of the tall condominiums and land on the beach? There are several factors a pilot would consider in this decision, one of which would be whether or not people on board the airplane could swim or not, whether or not he had flotation on board. This pilot makes the decision to stay along the road as opposed to going along the beach and making a landing on the beach itself or just off the coast where he wouldn't injure any passersby. On that particular day, it was a warm day. It was a relatively clear day in South Florida. It looked like a beautiful day. It's a Saturday. There was probably a lot of people on the beach. That may have factored into his decision not to land on the beach. A ditching can be an intimidating maneuver to a lot of pilots. It's commonly misunderstood. People think that in a high-wing airplane, a plane is likely to flip, but some research done by Paul Bertorelli shows that that's unlikely the case. And in ditching, some 90% of ditching incidents happen without a fatality. So a ditching airplane is not likely to flip, and you're not likely to have a fatality, but that's not commonly known. This pilot may have made the conscious decision not to ditch the airplane in the water, or he may have thought that he could not make the water once he started that turn back and decided to stay on the road in front of him. Choosing a road in a busy city or a congested area has its challenges also. Light poles, wires that run across the road. Oftentimes the roads are more narrow than the wingspan of an airplane. What commonly happens when drivers see an airplane coming in for an emergency landing, their first reaction, whether they're in front or behind, headed towards the airplane or headed away from the airplane, their common reaction is to hit the brakes. And so a factor to consider for pilots making this decision is the unknown reaction from people on the ground and drivers on the ground and pedestrians when they see an unusual circumstance like an airplane headed towards them or headed in their close proximity. That's an unknown, it's a variable that's hard to assess for pilots. In this case, the decision was at some point to take the road or move either side and take the water. In this case, the pilot chose the road. It looked like the pilot had the airplane under control to land on the road that he'd chosen. At some point, he strikes something. It could have been the SUV, or it could have happened before that, and he loses control of the airplane flips. We'll keep you updated on this accident as the NTSB investigation develops. Thanks for supporting AOPA so we can continue to provide you these analyses that help us all become better and safer pilots.